I never expected anything to change that day. It was a Tuesday like any other. I left the office at exactly 12 p.m., walked down the same 2 blocks to the park across the street, and sat on the third bench from the corner, the one under the maple tree that never quite shed all its leaves even in winter. That spot had become my midday ritual. A place to escape fluorescent lights and back-to-back meetings, to unwrap a lukewarm sandwich and scroll through meaningless headlines. But that day, something was different. Someone was missing. For almost 8 months I had shared that bench, silently, with a man most people refuse to acknowledge. A homeless man, to be precise. Middle-aged, maybe late 50s, with a thick beard streaked with grey and skin darkened by sun and time. He always wore the same heavy coat, oversized and patched in too many places to count. His boots were barely held together by duct tape, and his hands were always ink-stained. From the pen he clutched and the notebook he filled line after line every single day. He never asked for money, never looked up, he just sat there writing. His shopping cart was always parked behind the bench, filled with crumpled papers, clothes, a broken radio, and once, I swear, a chessboard missing every black piece. At first I avoided him. I sat on the far end of the bench, eyes fixed on my phone, pretending not to notice his smell or the way he muttered softly under his breath. But as the weeks passed, I stopped noticing those things. He became part of the routine, like the creaky bench, the pigeons pecking at nothing, the faint screech of buses halting at the corner. Familiar. Background. And then, that Tuesday, he wasn't there. I noticed it immediately, not because I missed him, or so I told myself, but because the balance was off. The bench felt longer, emptier. I sat anyway, unwrapped my sandwich, and tried to fall back into routine, but my eyes kept drifting to the spot where he usually sat. I scanned the park, expecting to see his cart somewhere nearby, maybe under a tree, maybe closer to the fountain. Nothing. Then I saw it. A folded piece of paper resting exactly where he used to sit. The edges were worn, and it was held down by a smooth, oval-shaped stone, the kind kids throw into ponds. Curious, I reached for it. The outside had a short message scrawled in uneven handwriting. To the man who never talks. I let out a dry laugh. Was this some joke? A prank from a bored teen? Still holding the sandwich in one hand, I unfolded the paper with the other. And then I read it. You don't know me and I don't know you, but we share space. And that matters more than people think. Most walk past me without a glance. You sit beside me without words. That silence is more honest than 1,000 conversations. I see the sadness in your eyes. You're not as invisible as you think. I blinked, unsure if I was reading too much into it. I looked around the park again, still empty. The note trembled slightly in my hand as a breeze swept past. I folded it carefully and placed it in my coat pocket. I didn't finish my sandwich that day. That night, I couldn't sleep. The note replayed in my head, each word digging deeper. How could someone who never looked at me know something I barely admitted to myself? I had a good job, a nice apartment, a LinkedIn profile filled with all the right buzzwords. But when I got home each night, I ate dinner in silence, stared at screens until I passed out, and woke up dreading everything except that quiet hour on the bench. The next day, I arrived at the park 10 minutes earlier than usual. He wasn't there. The bench was empty. But in the exact same spot, another note. This time it wasn't folded. It was wedged into a crack in the wood, as if meant to be found. I pulled it free. I wasn't always like this. I had a wife, a daughter, a job that made me feel important. Then I lost them. Not all at once, piece by piece, like a slow leak in a sinking boat. Grief is a quiet thief. It doesn't take everything right away. It waits. And when I had nothing left, I came to this bench. That's where I met you. There was no signature, no name, but for some reason I felt like I knew him more than I knew some people I spoke to every day. I sat down slowly, the note still in my hand, heart racing for no logical reason. It felt intimate, like reading someone's diary without permission, except the words were addressed to me, directed at something inside me I tried hard to keep buried. I went back the next day and the next. Each time he wasn't there, but the notes were, some were long, others just a few words. But all of them told stories, fragments of a life stitched together in ink and silence. One note simply read, "The hardest part isn't being forgotten, it's realizing you were never really seen in the first place." Another said, "You remind me of who I was before I disappeared. Maybe that's why I chose you." I stopped bringing my phone to the park. I stopped eating lunch. I just sat there, waiting, watching, hoping he'd return. But he didn't. A week later, the note came with an address, scrawled hastily, barely legible. No explanation, no message. Just a street and a number on the city's south side, a neighborhood I rarely visited. I hesitated for 2 days. Then on a Saturday afternoon, I took a cab there. The building was old, abandoned looking. The entrance was boarded, but one panel had been pried loose, revealing a narrow gap. Against every instinct, I squeezed through. Inside, the air was stale. Dust swirled in rays of light that pierced through cracks in the roof, and in the center of the room, laid out carefully on a weathered table, were notebooks, dozens of them, maybe more. Each one marked with a date. Each one, I realized, was written by him. And on top of the pile, another note, just 3 words, "Read, then speak." I stood frozen in that room for a long time. The scent of mold and old paper hung heavy in the air, and the silence felt almost sacred. These notebooks weren't scattered like trash. They were placed, each one stacked with care, as if someone had curated a private library no one was ever meant to find. I took a few hesitant steps toward the table, my shoes crunching softly on broken bits of plaster. My fingers hovered above the topmost notebook, the one resting beneath the 3-word note, "Read, then speak." I opened it gently. The first page was dated over 10 years ago. Day 1. No one spoke to me today, that's not new. What's new is that I noticed I miss the sound of my name. I miss the weight of being expected. I miss being tired for a reason. I walked for miles today. Found a bench that feels just detached enough to disappear on. I think I'll stay there a while. The handwriting was shaky at first, like someone relearning how to write. But it grew steadier with each page, more deliberate, more structured, like the very act of putting pen to paper was saving him one sentence at a time. I sat down on a crumbling crate nearby and read. For hours. I lost track of time, of the dust settling on my coat, of the noise from the street beyond the cracked windows. I devoured each entry like it was breathing life into some hollow part of me I didn't realize had gone numb. He wrote about his daughter, how she loved collecting smooth stones from the river, how she once refused to leave a grocery store without hugging every stuffed animal in the toy aisle. He wrote about how she stopped talking to him after the divorce, how he watched her from afar at a distance she didn't know was there. He wrote about his wife, who left quietly one day with a suitcase and a note that read simply, "I'm not angry. I'm empty." There were entries about his job, corporate, demanding, loud. He had been someone once, a manager, a man with a schedule and employees who pretended to laugh at his dry jokes. But when the housing crisis hit, he was downsized. Then the severance ran out. Then came the eviction, the storage unit, the shelter, the street. Being homeless isn't a sudden thing. It's a quiet erosion. One day you're a man who lost his job, and then you're a man who's bad with money. Then you're a man who's unreliable. Then you're just a problem people walk around. I read until my eyes burned. Then I read some more. By the time the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the floor like reaching arms, I had read 5 notebooks. There were dozens left. But something caught my eye. Tucked behind the largest stack was a photograph, creased and fading. It showed a much younger version of the man, clean-shaven, smiling stiffly beside a girl with wild curls and a gap-toothed grin. They were sitting on what looked like the same park bench. I ran my fingers over the image, feeling a knot form in my throat. This wasn't just a man documenting his descent. This was a man who had preserved his existence when the world chose to erase it. I left the building reluctantly, the photo and one notebook clutched in my hands. I didn't sleep that night. I kept rereading the pages by lamplight, wondering how I could have sat next to this ocean of a person and never asked a single question. The next morning, I returned to the bench. No notes this time, just the usual breeze, the distant traffic, the hollow spot beside me. I pulled the notebook from my bag and opened to a blank page. My hand trembled slightly as I wrote, "You were seen." I didn't know if he would ever come back. I didn't know if he was even alive, but I knew I couldn't let his words disappear into dust. So I began typing. Every night after work, I transcribed one notebook, then two. I cleaned up the grammar when necessary, but I never altered the voice. His words were honest, raw, sacred. I posted one of the stories online anonymously, under a blog I called Whispers Unheard. No SEO tricks, no photos, just the story titled "The Bench Between Us." To my surprise, it got shared, then re-shared. Within a week, it had 10,000 views. Comments poured in. People cried. People related. Some said it reminded them of their fathers, others of their own silence. I received dozens of messages from strangers, thanking me for giving a voice to someone they would have never seen on the street. I kept going. I posted more stories, his stories. And slowly, something in me changed. At work, I no longer felt like a ghost behind a desk. I spoke up more. I reconnected with my sister, whom I hadn't called in months. I volunteered one weekend at a local shelter, the same one he had mentioned in a notebook. And then, one day, there was a package at my door. No return address. Inside, a new notebook. On the first page, "I knew you'd write back eventually." I stared at the notebook for several minutes before even touching it. The handwriting was undeniably his, slanted but precise. The paper was the same rough kind he'd used in all the others. But this one was different. This one was addressed directly to me. I could feel it. Not like the other entries that were more like fragments from his past. This kind was a conversation, or the continuation of one that had started without either of us realizing. The first entry didn't start with a date, just a simple sentence written in bold strokes. "So you found the room, that means you stayed longer than most." I sat down slowly, the weight of the notebook heavier than it should have been. The air in my apartment felt thicker, as if something intangible had followed me from that building. I flipped the page and kept reading. "I didn't expect anyone to find the notebooks. Truth is, I thought I'd die before they mattered. That's what usually happens. You collect your thoughts in the dark, hoping one day the light will find them. But most of the time it doesn't. You change that. Not by asking questions, not by giving money, just by sitting next to me like I was made of something other than shame. There's power in not turning away." My hands tightened around the edge of the notebook. I swallowed hard. I hadn't known what to expect when I began writing back. I didn't even know if I was doing it for him or for myself. But now every page I turned felt like a thread pulling me closer to someone I had barely known, and yet who had somehow seen me better than anyone else in my life. He wrote about observing me, about how I always checked my watch 3 times before standing up, how I paused before biting into my sandwich, like I was weighing whether I deserved to eat it, how I sighed louder on Wednesdays. He noticed these things. He counted them. "You're good at pretending you're okay, but I know that sound. The sound of a man crumbling silently. I've made that sound too." I had to stop reading for a while after that. I looked around my apartment, sterile, untouched, expensive. There were paintings I didn't like, furniture I didn't choose, a wine rack filled with bottles I rarely opened. It was a place meant to impress, a showroom for a life I didn't live. I went to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and caught my own reflection in the dark window. He was right. I didn't look sad. I looked absent, like someone had hollowed me out and left the frame intact. Back on the couch, I resumed reading. He told me stories I hadn't seen, about the people in the park, the woman with the green scarf who always fed pigeons but never smiled, the jogger who paused at the same tree every day and whispered a name carved into the bark, the old man who circled the fountain 3 times before sitting down, always 3 times, never more, never less. Everyone's hurting. The world taught them to hide it, but pain isn't invisible. You just have to stop looking past it. One entry stood out among the rest. It was longer. It had a date, the only one in the notebook. 3 years ago, March 18th. That was the day I almost didn't come back to the bench. I'd spent the night under the bridge near 5th and Lex. It rained hard, the kind of rain that makes you feel like the sky's trying to erase you. I had fever, shaking. I couldn't feel my toes. I honestly didn't think I'd wake up. But I did, barely, and I walked back. Don't ask me why. Maybe I just didn't want to die alone. You sat there that day. You didn't even look at me, but you were there. And something about that felt like defiance, like we were both refusing to vanish quietly. I closed the notebook and pressed it to my chest. That date. I remembered that day. It had rained. I'd nearly stayed in the office, but I was too restless. I needed air. I remembered seeing him soaked, slumped forward more than usual, his notebook limp in his lap. I remember hesitating, thinking for a moment I should ask if he needed help. But I didn't. I sat, ate, and left without a word. I had no idea how close to death he'd been. And yet, he thanked me for being there. That thought shattered something inside me. For the next few weeks, I became obsessed. I read and reread every notebook I had. Each one felt like a puzzle piece, but I couldn't see the full picture yet. I began tracing places he mentioned. I visited the shelter he'd described, the alley where he found a dog that stayed with him for 2 winters before disappearing, the church where a nun had once given him soup without asking his name. I left notes at the park, one each day, when short ones at first and then longer, then letters. I didn't know if he'd ever return. I didn't know if he was alive. But I couldn't let the silence win. Not again. One day, a note came back. Not a notebook. Just a folded sheet of paper resting exactly where his first one had been all those months ago. It read, "If you still want answers, meet me where the world forgot us both." There was no address, no name. But I knew where to go. I took the next morning off work for the first time in 2 years. I didn't give a reason. I just said something important came up and turned off my phone. I dressed simply, left the watch behind, and tucked the latest note into my coat pocket like a compass. "Where the world forgot us both." I whispered those words over and over as I walked, trying to let instinct guide me. And it did. There was only one place that fit, an overpass on the south end of the city, hidden between train tracks and a stretch of graffiti-covered warehouses. It wasn't a place you passed through by accident. You either went there to vanish or because you already had. It was the same place he mentioned in one of the early notebooks, the bridge where he'd almost frozen to death. The same place he said he'd stopped believing in time. When I arrived, I didn't see him at first. The space was dim, the sky above blocked by concrete ribs and crumbling edges. But then, as my eyes adjusted, I spotted a figure sitting cross-legged on a flattened cardboard box, his back against the cold wall. He wasn't wearing the heavy coat anymore, just a faded hoodie and pants too large for his frame. The same beard, the same ink-stained hands. But something about him was different. He looked lighter, not thinner, lighter. As if something he'd carried for years had finally been set down. He looked up as I approached, and for the first time our eyes met. There was no drama, no slow-motion music, just silence, recognition, a nod that carried the weight of everything we hadn't said. I sat on the ground beside him, no words. The train thundered overhead, vibrating the concrete beneath us. We waited for it to pass, as if the noise were a wall we had to let crumble first. Finally, he spoke. "You came." His voice was rough, lower than I remembered, but not weak. More like a song sung in a register I hadn't heard before. I nodded. "You asked me to." He smiled faintly. "I wasn't sure you would." I pulled the last notebook from my bag, the one he'd sent without warning. "You knew I would." He shrugged. "Hope and certainty aren't the same thing." We sat there side by side, staring at the oil stains and broken glass scattered across the concrete like fallen stars. He didn't ask questions, didn't explain why he disappeared or why he returned. Instead, he told me a story about a man who used to sit on the 42nd floor of a building with windows so clean he forgot they were there. a man who could measure his value in revenue charts and the silence that followed after meetings when no one dared challenge his decisions. That man had a wife who called him a ghost, a daughter who stopped calling altogether, a best friend who died while waiting for him to show up at a birthday dinner. He didn't cry as he spoke. Neither did I. The words weren't sharp anymore. They had been dulled by time, smoothed by repetition. What remained was not guilt, but clarity. "I thought I had time," he said. "Thought I'd fix it all someday. But you don't get a warning when someday ends." I looked at him, unsure what to say. But I didn't need to speak. He already knew. "You're not me," he added, as if he could hear my thoughts. "But you're standing on the same ledge I once did, looking down, wondering how far you'd fall." His words hit harder than I expected. He leaned back, resting his head against the wall. "Most people look at us," he said, gesturing vaguely to the bridge, the concrete, the emptiness, "and they think this is where we gave up. But they don't understand. This is where we woke up." I asked him then, finally, "Why me?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled a small bundle from behind him, wrapped in cloth, tied with string. He handed it to me. I unwrapped it slowly. Inside were 3 things: a smooth riverstone, a worn photograph of him with his daughter, and a final notebook. The last one. On its cover, in neat block letters, it read, "Tell it right." He looked at me with the kind of gaze you only see once in your life, the kind that doesn't ask for forgiveness or understanding, but trusts you with a piece of truth too heavy to carry alone. "I'm leaving," he said simply. I froze. "Where?" He shook his head. "Somewhere quieter. Somewhere without benches." I didn't argue. I knew what he meant. He stood, bones creaking, and placed a hand on my shoulder. It was the only time he touched me. "You saved more of me than I ever gave you." Then he walked away. No drama, no goodbye. Just the quiet echo of steps fading into the city's forgotten veins. I stayed there for hours, holding the bundle in my lap, the weight of it anchoring me to the ground, and yet lifting something inside me I hadn't known was buried. It's been 8 months since I saw him. 8 months since that morning under the bridge, when he placed his hand on my shoulder and walked into the mist of the city's silence, leaving behind only a bundle of memories and a promise I hadn't yet made, but one he trusted I would keep. I didn't go back to the park right away. I couldn't. It wasn't grief, it was reverence. That bench had become more than a place. It was a boundary, a sacred line between who I had been and who I might become. I knew if I sat there again, I'd have to choose which side of that line I'd walk back into. Instead, I returned to the notebooks. Every night, I opened one. And slowly I began to transcribe not just the words, but the weight behind them. I stopped cleaning up his grammar. I stopped modernizing his phrasing. The rawness was the beauty. The imperfections were the truth. Each word he wrote wasn't just part of a sentence. It was a thread in the fabric of a man who had been unwoven by life and stitched himself back together with honesty. I shared his stories online, anonymously at first. I posted fragments, sometimes a paragraph, sometimes a full entry, on a simple website I called Whispers Unheard. No ads, no names, just a space for echoes. And something unexpected happened. People began writing back, emails, comments, letters. Some sent stories of their own. Others simply said, "Thank you." A few said, "That was me." But most said nothing at all, just a single sentence, often the same. I thought I was the only one. The site grew, not viral, not overnight, but organically, like ivy climbing a forgotten wall, slow and strong. Eventually, I began adding more than his words. I added mine, not just as a narrator, but as a witness. I wrote about the days I sat beside him, about the first note, about the notebooks, about the silence between us that somehow said more than conversation ever could. I changed jobs, left finance behind. The money didn't matter anymore. I began working with a non-profit that focused on housing security. I met people like him, people with names, faces, and stories that never made headlines, but who carried universes inside them, just like he did. Sometimes I'd find myself pausing in the middle of a conversation, remembering a line from his notebook. They became a compass, a mirror, a set of coordinates for how to navigate a world that often forgets to look beyond appearances. One day, I received an envelope. No name, no return address. Just a simple phrase on the front. Still watching, still writing. Inside, a new notebook. But this one wasn't filled with his thoughts. It was filled with theirs. People he had met after disappearing. Brief interactions, notes of kindness, pain, gratitude. A woman who shared her last piece of bread with a stranger on the subway. A boy who placed a blanket on a sleeping man in winter. A bus driver who stopped for a passenger who missed the stop every morning but always smiled. These were the voices of people we never interview, never profile, never applaud. But they were the quiet architects of humanity. At the end of the notebook, one final message. We are never just one story. We are the echoes of every person who chose not to look away. That's when I knew what he had given me wasn't just memory. It was legacy. I returned to the park soon after. The maple tree still stood, stubbornly clinging to its leaves. The bench was there, sun-bleached and cracked, waiting. I sat on the same side I always had. The silence was different now, not empty but full, like it was listening. I took out a pen and a fresh notebook. I wrote, "To the one who left a note, I saw you, and I will make sure the world does too." I left it on the bench, weighed down by a smooth river stone, and walked away.